You've been here before. You picked up a new skill, a language, an instrument, a discipline, with real intention. You set aside time. You found the courses, the books, the playlists. You showed up. And months later, you looked at the distance between where you started and where you are. And the honest answer was, almost nothing changed. So you reached for the explanation that hurts the least. You're not naturally gifted. You don't have the right kind of brain. Some people are just built for this, and you aren't one of them. Or maybe it's simpler. You didn't put in enough hours. If you just studied more, practiced longer, stayed more consistent, it would come. Both of those explanations are wrong. And more importantly, they're protecting something you haven't questioned yet. The problem isn't your talent. It isn't your discipline. It isn't even your consistency. The problem is the method itself, the fundamental structure of how you've been approaching learning. And the cruel irony is that everything you were taught to do, everything that feels like studying, is almost perfectly designed to prevent your brain from actually acquiring skill. Josh Waitzkin was a chess prodigy who became a national champion before adolescence. Then he walked away from chess entirely and started over, becoming a world champion in Tai Chi Chuan, then compressing years of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu into a fraction of the time it takes most serious practitioners. He didn't do this because he had a magic brain. He did it because he had spent decades studying not just the disciplines themselves, but the process of learning, what actually creates skill inside a human nervous system, and what merely creates the feeling of effort. What he found was not a motivational framework. It was a diagnosis. The way most people learn is not just inefficient, it is structurally incompatible with how the brain builds competence. Every hour spent in passive consumption, every comfortable repetition of something already known, every session that avoids the specific thing you cannot yet do, your brain is not registering any of it as learning. It is registering it as maintenance, as staying still. The gap between people who acquire skills at a startling pace and people who plateau for years is not talent. It is not even dedication. It is method. And method is something you can change today with the material in front of you. If you're willing to accept that everything you've been doing has been fighting against your own neurology. That is what this is about. Not inspiration. Not a new system to add to the pile. A fundamental reckoning with why the hours you've already invested produced so little, and what it actually means to learn something. The first thing to understand is what your brain is actually doing when you think you're studying, because it's not what you think. Most people believe the brain learns through exposure. Spend enough time around a language and it absorbs. Play a piece enough times and the fingers remember. Read the chapter enough times and the knowledge sticks. Repetition equals learning. This is the assumption underneath almost every study habit you've ever had. And it is almost entirely false. Your brain does not learn through exposure. It learns through correction. Specifically, it learns when it attempts something it cannot yet do, fails, receives feedback on that failure, and adjusts. That cycle, attempt, failure, correction, reattempt, is what triggers neuroplasticity. That is what causes new neural connections to form. Everything else, every hour spent in comfortable repetition, every passive session where you consume without producing, every practice run of something you already know, your brain files it under already handled. No new wiring, no real acquisition, just the sensation of effort without the biology of learning. Waitzkin named the distinction precisely. There is repetition and there is deliberate practice. They look similar from the outside. Both involve time, both involve the material, both feel like work. But only one of them is actually work as far as your nervous system is concerned. Repetition is doing what you already can, comfortably, repeatedly. Deliberate practice is targeting exactly what you cannot do, isolating it, and forcing your brain to confront the specific gap between your current ability and the next level. The musician who practices a full song 100 times is doing repetition. The musician who identifies the 4 bars they consistently fail, slows them down to half speed, and runs those 4 bars, only those 4 bars, until they are clean, then integrates them back into the whole. That is deliberate practice. The second musician progresses in a week, what the first doesn't reach in months. Same instrument, same time, completely different neurology. This is why your progress has been so slow. Not because you haven't practiced, you probably have, but because the practice has been comfortable. You've been circling what you already know, returning to the parts that feel good, avoiding the precise moments of failure that would actually teach you something. The discomfort you've been avoiding is not an obstacle to learning, it is learning. The failure you've been trying to minimize is the exact mechanism your brain needs to build new capability. The implications of this are uncomfortable in their own right, because it means that the student who studies for 3 hours in a state of vague engagement learns less than the student who practices for 30 minutes in a state of targeted discomfort. It means that the feeling of effort, the sensation of having worked hard, has almost no correlation with actual skill acquisition. You can spend years producing the feeling of learning without producing learning itself. What your brain needs is not more hours, it needs different hours. Hours spent in the specific zone where you are failing at something you care about getting right, receiving feedback on that failure, and trying again. That zone is uncomfortable by design. Your instinct is to leave it as quickly as possible. Every time you do, you've chosen the feeling of competence over its reality. But isolating the right failure, knowing exactly what to practice and what to ignore, requires something most people skip entirely. It requires you to understand how skill is actually structured. And that's where almost everyone gets the architecture wrong from the start. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. The first mistake is trying to learn the whole thing. You decide to learn a language, and you try to learn the language. All of it, simultaneously, as one undivided object. You decide to learn an instrument, and you approach it as a single, monolithic challenge. This feels logical. The skill is the goal, so you aim at the skill. But this is precisely where the architecture collapses, because no complex skill exists as a single thing. Every discipline you have ever admired in someone else is an aggregate. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of micro-skills stacked and integrated over time. And the brain does not learn aggregates, it learns components. Waitzkin called this chunking. The idea is not simply to break a skill into smaller pieces. It is to identify which pieces are foundational, which carry the most structural weight, and to dominate those before touching anything else. The 20% of sub-skills that generate 80% of functional competence, not a shortcut, a sequence, the correct order of construction. Take the guitar. The instinct is to learn a song, something real, something that sounds like music. So you attempt the whole thing, badly, repeatedly. You get a vague, broken version of the entire piece, rather than a clean, solid version of any part of it. Waitzkin's approach inverts this entirely. You isolate one transition, G to C, nothing else, and you do not move forward until that transition is automatic. Then you add one more element. The foundation is not partial. It is complete before the next layer is placed on top of it. This matters because the brain builds competence the way a structure holds weight. A foundation with gaps doesn't become more stable as you build higher. It becomes more likely to fail. Every skill you've acquired at a surface level without a solid base underneath is a flaw built on weakness. You can feel it when pressure arrives. The moment you're actually tested, the moment someone is watching, the moment it has to work. The whole structure trembles. What chunking demands is something most learners find genuinely painful. It demands that you resist the pull toward breadth. The desire to know a little of everything is not curiosity. It is avoidance. Avoidance of the specific grinding work of mastering one small thing completely before the next. Breadth feels like progress. It produces the sensation of covering ground. But ground covered without depth is not territory you own. It is territory you've passed through and will have to revisit, repeatedly, forever. This is the pattern Waitzkin saw in every domain he entered. The practitioners who plateaued early had almost always rushed the foundation. They moved forward before the base was solid, piling complexity onto instability, and eventually hit a ceiling they couldn't understand. Because the problem wasn't at the top, it was at the bottom, buried under years of accumulated surface-level exposure. The practitioners who kept developing, who were still improving years after others had stopped, had built differently from the beginning, slower at first, more patient with the small things, more willing to stay inside a single component until it became automatic, until it no longer required conscious attention, until it freed up cognitive space for the next layer. That patience is not passive. It is a specific kind of aggression directed inward, at the exact gap between what you can do and what you cannot. And filling that gap requires something most people spend years avoiding: the willingness to fail in real time, with real feedback from the very first day. There is a preparation ritual that almost every learner performs, and almost no one questions. Before you try to speak the language, you study grammar for 6 months. Before you write the code, you watch 50 tutorials. Before you play in front of anyone, you practice alone until you feel ready. The logic seems sound. Build a foundation of knowledge first, then apply it. What could be wrong with being prepared? Everything. Because readiness, in this context, is a fiction your brain invented to protect you from failure. The accumulation of input before output is not preparation. It is postponement, dressed as discipline. And the cruelest part is that it feels responsible. It feels like the mature approach, unlike those reckless people who jump in without knowing what they're doing. But those reckless people are acquiring real skill while you are acquiring the feeling of being almost ready. Waitzkin was unambiguous about this. The brain does not learn from consuming information about a skill. It learns from attempting the skill, failing at it, and being corrected in real time. The gap between knowing something conceptually and being able to execute it under pressure is not filled by more input. It is filled only by output, by doing, badly, repeatedly, with feedback from the very beginning. Consider what actually happens when you force output from day one. You speak the broken sentence, and the native speaker corrects your pronunciation. Your brain encodes that correction in context, attached to a real communicative attempt, a real moment of failure, a real response. That encoding is orders of magnitude stronger than memorizing the same rule in a grammar book, because your brain tags contextual, emotionally charged learning as important. Abstract rules, consumed passively, get filed as low priority. Real failures, in real situations, get filed as survival critical. The biology is not subtle about this. The error compounds over time in a specific way. Every month spent consuming before producing is a month of building what researchers call the illusion of knowing, a feeling of familiarity with material that has never been tested against reality. You recognize the grammar rule when you see it. You understand the chord structure when someone explains it. You follow the logic of the code when you read it. And none of that recognition will save you the moment you have to produce it yourself, under any pressure whatsoever, because recognition and production are different cognitive operations built on different neural infrastructure. When you finally attempt output after months of input, the collapse is disorienting. You thought you knew it. You had spent all that time. The material felt familiar. But familiarity is not competence. It is the shadow of competence, cast without any of the substance. Waitzkin saw this in every domain. The students who progressed fastest were not the most prepared. They were the most willing to be wrong in public, early. They generated errors before they had any business generating errors, and those errors became the raw material their brains actually learned from. The students who waited until they felt ready often never felt ready, because the readiness never came. Because readiness comes from output, not from more input. You already know what you've been postponing, the language you haven't spoken yet, the thing you've been studying but not practicing, the skill you've been consuming content about instead of actually doing. The longer you wait, the more the gap between your input and your output calcifies into a habit of avoidance that becomes harder to break with every passing week. But even when you begin, even when you force the output and start accumulating real experience, there will come a moment where everything seems to stop, where the progress that felt inevitable suddenly disappears, and how you respond to that moment will determine almost everything. Every learner hits it. The early phase produces visible progress. You can feel yourself improving. The gap between yesterday and today is measurable. The feedback is immediate and gratifying. Then, without warning, it stops. You practice the same way you always have. You put in the same hours, and nothing moves. The skill feels frozen. You feel frozen. And the mind, searching for an explanation, lands on the most available one. You've reached your limit. This is the plateau, and it kills more potential than any other single phenomenon in the psychology of learning. What makes it lethal is not the plateau itself. It is the story the plateau generates. Because the absence of visible progress feels identical to the absence of progress. The sensation is the same whether you are genuinely stagnating or whether your brain is doing something invisible, structural, and necessary. And most people never learn to tell the difference. They feel the plateau, they interpret it as a ceiling, and they stop, usually within weeks of the breakthrough that would have changed everything. Waitzkin understood the plateau differently. He saw it not as stagnation, but as consolidation. A period where the brain is reorganizing what it has already acquired, building the deeper infrastructure that will support the next leap. The neural connections formed during active practice are being stabilized, integrated, made automatic. The skill is going underground before it resurfaces at a higher level. Nothing visible is happening because the work is now happening below the surface. This reframe is not motivational, it is neurological. The brain does not improve in a straight line. It improves in a pattern that looks like a plateau followed by a sudden jump, because that is literally what is occurring at the level of synaptic consolidation. The flatness is not failure. It is the necessary precondition for the next stage of competence. But here is what Waitzkin also observed. The plateau cannot be bypassed through more effort of the same kind. Pushing harder at exactly what you've been doing does not accelerate consolidation. It often impedes it. What the plateau requires is continued deliberate practice, specifically targeting the edges of current ability, combined with something most high achievers are constitutionally resistant to: genuine rest, not distraction, not switching to a different form of productivity, actual cognitive disengagement, the condition under which the brain does its deepest consolidation work. The people who break through plateaus are not the ones who grind harder. They are the ones who understand what the plateau actually is, maintain their practice with precision rather than panic, and allow the rest cycles that make consolidation possible. They treat the flatness as information rather than verdict. Everyone else quits, not dramatically, rarely with a conscious decision. They just gradually reduce the sessions, let the days between practice grow longer, tell themselves they'll return when they feel more motivated. They step back precisely when staying was the only thing required, and they carry the story forward, that they tried, that they gave it real time, that they simply weren't built for it. That story is almost never true. What is almost always true is that they left on the edge of a breakthrough they never saw coming. The plateau is the final filter. Most people don't fail to learn because they lack talent or intelligence. They fail because they cannot tolerate the specific discomfort of progress that isn't visible. If you can sit inside that discomfort, Keep practicing with precision. Keep resting with intention. Keep trusting the biology. The breakthrough arrives. It always does. What determines whether you make it through is not willpower. It is something more structural. The way you organize your time and attention during practice itself. Because even the most committed learner, with the right method and the right mindset, will sabotage their progress if the architecture of their sessions is wrong. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. The assumption underneath most learning culture is that more time equals more progress, that the person who puts in 6 hours is developing faster than the person who puts in 2. That commitment is measured in duration. This assumption is so embedded in how we think about effort that questioning it feels almost like an excuse, like you're looking for permission to do less. But the assumption is wrong, and clinging to it is costing you more than you realize. Your brain does not learn in proportion to time invested. It learns in proportion to the quality of attention during practice and the quality of rest that follows it. Waitzkin trained in sprints, not because he lacked discipline, but because he understood what extended sessions actually produce, diminishing returns that collapse into negative returns. After a certain threshold, which research places somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes of genuine cognitive intensity, the quality of attention degrades so sharply that continued practice does not merely stop producing learning. It begins encoding errors. You are practicing, but what you are ingraining is the fatigued, degraded version of the skill. And the brain doesn't distinguish between sharp practice and exhausted practice. It records both. This is why the musician who practices 4 hours of declining attention progresses slower than the musician who practices 90 minutes of absolute focus. Not because effort is wrong, because diffuse effort, spread across hours of diminishing quality, produces diffuse results. The brain consolidates what it actually experienced, and what it experienced was mostly noise. The protocol Waitzkin refined was built around this biology. Short, intense sessions, 25 to 90 minutes of complete cognitive presence, no phone, no interruptions, no partial attention. Then a genuine break, not a scroll through something else, not a switch to another task, but actual disengagement, a walk, silence, something that makes no demands on the same cognitive systems being trained. Then another sprint, if the session requires it. Then a longer rest. What this demands is something modern productivity culture is almost entirely hostile to: the acceptance that rest is not the opposite of progress. Rest is where progress consolidates. The neuroplasticity triggered during deliberate practice, the formation of new synaptic connections, does not complete during the practice itself. It completes during the recovery period that follows. Sleep is the most powerful consolidation window of all. A learner who practices with intensity and sleeps well is outpacing a learner who practices twice as long and runs on exhaustion, regardless of how the hours look on paper. The implication is uncomfortable because it removes duration as a source of identity. You cannot tell yourself you worked hard based on how long you sat with the material. The only honest measure is the quality of attention during the session and whether genuine rest followed it. That is a much harder thing to manufacture or fake. Most people will not change this. The long, diffuse session feels like more. It looks like more. It is easier to defend to yourself and others. 6 hours of scattered practice is a story you can tell. 90 minutes of surgical focus followed by rest sounds to the untrained ear, like not trying hard enough. So people keep choosing the long session, keep accumulating the feeling of effort, and keep wondering why the hours they're investing aren't producing the results they expected. The structure of your sessions is not a minor detail. It is one of the primary variables determining how fast you grow. Fix the structure, and everything you've already learned about deliberate practice and chunking and output compounds into something that actually moves. Leave it broken, and even the right method produces the wrong results. You now have the full architecture. What remains is the hardest question, not how to learn, but whether you will actually change anything. Because understanding a system and dismantling the habits that made the old one feel safe are two entirely different acts. Here is the truth this entire video has been building toward, and the one most people will find a way to avoid. You already knew something was wrong with how you were learning. Not the specifics, not the neuroscience of consolidation, or the mechanics of deliberate practice, but the feeling. The sense that the hours weren't adding up, that the progress was too slow relative to the effort, that something in the equation was off. You felt it, and you kept going anyway, because changing the method is harder than changing the hours, and changing the hours at least feels like trying. What Waitzkin offers is not a shortcut. That framing is too comfortable, too easy to dismiss. What he offers is a confrontation with a specific form of self-deception that most learners carry for years without naming it. The belief that effort and learning are the same thing. They are not. Effort is what you feel. Learning is what your nervous system actually does. And the two can be almost entirely disconnected for months, for years, without you ever noticing. Because the feeling of effort is real, even when the learning isn't happening. The people who acquire skills at a pace that seems unfair are not more talented. They are not working harder in the way that word is usually meant. They are doing something structurally different. They are spending their time in the specific zone where the brain actually changes, failing at something precise, correcting it in real time, building from foundations rather than surfaces, forcing output before they feel ready, moving through plateaus without interpreting them as verdicts, resting with the same intention they bring to practice. Every hour they invest is an hour the brain registers as real. Every hour you've spent in the old way was an hour the brain largely ignored. The gap between those two learners is not talent, it is method, and method is a choice. But here is where the hardest truth arrives. Knowing this, understanding it clearly, feeling the logic of it land, is not the same as changing. Most people who encounter these ideas will recognize them, agree with them, and return within days to the comfortable inefficiency they've always used. Not because they're weak, but because the old method is familiar, and familiar feels safe, and safe feels like a reasonable thing to protect. The discomfort of deliberate practice, of failing at something specific in real time, of forcing output before readiness, of sitting inside a plateau without the reassurance of visible progress. That discomfort is not theoretical. It is real, and it arrives immediately, and the brain will generate every available rationalization to help you avoid it. This is the actual threshold, not understanding the method. You now understand it. The threshold is whether you are willing to practice in a way that feels worse than what you've been doing, in exchange for results that will take longer to arrive than you want them to. That exchange is what learning actually costs, and most people, when they feel the price in real time, decide it's too high. If you're willing to pay it, if you can sit inside that discomfort with the knowledge of what it's producing, then the advantage you'll have over people using the old method is not small. It is not marginal. It is the difference between years and months, between plateaus that last forever and ceilings that keep rising. That is what Waitzkin built his life demonstrating, across disciplines, from scratch, repeatedly. Not that he was exceptional, that the method works, and that almost nobody uses it. Take one thing from this video. Not 10, not the full framework. 1. The specific gap in your current learning you've been avoiding. Name it. Isolate it. Practice it until it closes. That single act, applied with real intention, will teach you more about how your brain learns than everything you've watched or read about learning so far. The understanding is already in you. What comes next is the part you actually have to do. If something in this video reached something you've been carrying for a while, leave it in the comments. Not what you're going to do, but what you've been avoiding. And when you're ready to go deeper into how the mind builds mastery under pressure, the next video is already waiting. You don't need to look for it. You'll know when it's time.